Good evening, everyone. I'm Janet Dolan, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Minnesota Peace Initiative Fall Program. Welcome to those of you who have attended previous programs, to those of you attending for the first time this evening, and to our panelists. On behalf of the Norway House and our Minnesota Peace Initiative Committee, we want to acknowledge all that our country and our community has been through this year. As hope for an effective vaccine rises, our hopes rise also that our lives will get back to normal. However, will we really get back to our pre-COVID lives? Or will some of the COVID changes become our new normal? Has COVID brought changes that would have come eventually, but whose arrival has been greatly expedited by our need to adapt to COVID? That is what we will explore this evening. First, a brief word about our program format this evening. Because this is a webinar, the panelists and I can see each other and speak to each other, but we cannot communicate with you. Therefore, I would like to cover a few of the rules for this webinar. First, to ask a question, click on the Q&A wherever it's located on your screen. A box will appear. You can fill in your question and hit send. Our committee will collect your questions. We will get to as many as time allows. It takes some effort to organize the questions, so I urge you to begin sending in your questions as soon as you can. And finally, to leave the webinar, select end and then leave the meeting. For those of you attending for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about who we are and why we do these programs. The Minnesota Peace Initiative provides a forum to delve deeply into challenging global issues. Like James Madison, we believe a well-informed electorate is essential for an effective democracy. We bring you experts on important, timely topics, and there is no more timely topic in 2020 than the COVID pandemic. While none of us has a crystal ball, experts are starting to predict that, like with other pandemics, COVID will permanently change some aspects of our daily life. The Black Plague changed Europe drastically, leading the transition from the feudal age to the Renaissance. The pandemic of 1918, along with the impact of World War I, ushered in the decline of the empires and colonialism, and a rise in dissatisfaction with the old world order. What will the impact of COVID be? That will take decades to determine, but we are already seeing some of the clues. While there are a wide range of pre-COVID areas of our life that we could consider, we have selected 3. 1, where and how we will live and work. What will be some of the changes impacting downtowns, suburbs, and small towns, as well as the services that support them, such as entertainment, hospitality, and transportation. 2, healthcare and its delivery. COVID is straining our healthcare systems. How do we better prepare for future pandemics? Telemedicine is clearly in our future, but how much of it is here now, thanks to COVID? 3, the state of the world. What will COVID's lasting impact be on globalization, nationalization, alliances, and global resources and their distribution? What does our COVID experience tell us about the world's ability to work together to meet the challenges of climate change? To discuss these areas, we have brought together 3 exceptional panelists, each of whom is deeply immersed in COVID and its impact on their particular area. 3 of our panelists will start us out with their opening remarks. Since this is only our second webinar, we pre-taped our opening remarks so we could better focus our energy on the live portion of our program this evening. Following our opening remarks, we will then open it up to questions for the panel and your questions. But first of all, let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Professor Thomas Fisher, Director of the Minnesota Design Center, Director of MSSD, and the Dayton Hudson Chair in Urban Design. Professor Fisher is a graduate of Cornell University in architecture, and he holds a Master's of Arts in Intellectual History from Case Western University. He previously was the editorial director of Progressive Architecture magazine. He is the author of an extensive list of professional articles and books. In 2005, he was recognized as the 5th most published writer about architecture in the United States. He has been named 4 times to the list of top 25 design educators by Design Intelligence. He's currently working on his latest book entitled On-Demand Cities. Welcome, Professor Fisher.
We're in the midst of one of the great pandemics in human history, and as has happened with pandemics in the past, they do 2 things. They, one hand, they reveal the inequities and the dysfunctions of the way in which the world was working prior to the pandemic, and then they also accelerate us rapidly into the future. And so there are these paradigm shifting moments in human history. We've seen this in the past with the cholera epidemics in the 19th century, led us to having indoor plumbing, which allowed us to have denser cities, which really allowed for the rise of industrial cities, major cities, triggered by a pandemic. We saw this in 1918 with the flu epidemic, which actually encouraged people to want to socially distance. And we saw after that pandemic, the rise of people wanting to have private automobiles, wanting to live in single family houses further away from each other, and the rise of suburbanization, which became the dominant way in which people lived throughout much of the 20th century. And so we are now seeing again through this pandemic, a dramatic shift in the relationship between the physical world and the digital world. Opportunities and technologies that existed prior to the pandemic, like distance learning, online shopping, telecommuting, telehealth, all of those things existed, and the technology existed to enable those things to happen, but they remained marginal parts of our economy and of our daily lives. We still maintained the 20th century habit of thinking we had to commute to an office and sit in an office 9 to 5, which was an idea that was at least 100 years old. One of the things that this pandemic has revealed to us is that we don't have to do that, that actually we can live and work pretty much anywhere where there's a decent connection to the internet. And that, in fact, we can be more productive not going to the office, but working out of our homes. That, in fact, it may be easier to have goods and services shipped to us rather than us constantly getting in a car and driving to find things. And so the dominance of online shopping, and now we are learning that, in fact, although distance learning has its limitations, that in fact, there's some research showing that for many students, some amount of distance learning is actually preferable to sitting in a classroom, that many students do better when they can learn at their own pace and go back and review material. And so we're seeing that a lot of the things that were marginal prior to the pandemic have become dominant and will remain dominant aspects of our lives going forward. The other thing, though, that pandemics show is the inequities and dysfunctions that existed in the old normal. And now we're, of course, seeing that where we're seeing a potentially 2-class economy emerging of people who can work remotely at home and those who are essential workers and can't. And the essential workers tend to be lower paid. They're obviously more exposed to illness with this pandemic. Yet we have to be careful that we don't create an economy of delivery people and remote workers, right? Which could potentially be the future economy. And we also have seen a lot of unemployment among, waitresses, waiters, people who worked in the hospitality industries. And so we're going to see, I think, a greater level of inequality, even more so than what existed prior to the pandemic. And so we have to really take equity seriously. And I think we have to recognize that our essential workers are that. They are essential, and that they need to be not only well protected, but also better paid, because quite frankly, the economy will not work without them being in a position to sustain all of us through the delivery of goods and services. Maybe one way to summarize what's going on is that we have been and are in the midst of really looking at what is the relationship between the physical environment and the digital environment. What needs to be done face to face, and there will still be a lot of activities that do need to happen face to face, but I think what we're seeing is that those will be about experiences that you can't get online. And meanwhile, a lot of the more routine kinds of activities are going to now happen digitally, with things being delivered to us. This is all happening at the same time that we're going through rapid automation of a lot of the work. There's been research out of the University of Oxford that has shown that as much as half of the jobs that exist now are highly vulnerable to automation in the next decade or so. And so essentially what we're doing is we are automating everything that is predictable, boring, or dangerous for humans to do. Turns out humans, we're not particularly good at doing boring, repetitive work. Machines are much better at that. And so simultaneously with this pandemic, we're going through the back end of what I think of as the Industrial Revolution, which is that we have spent the last 150 years or so automating work that people weren't good at, couldn't do. And we are now at the sort of tail end of that, where we're converting a lot of white collar knowledge work into software. And so the new economy that we will come into after this pandemic will also be one in which a lot of activities are automated. And we will be back to looking at things that humans are actually pretty good at. I call them the 6 C's. And then when you look at the research at the kinds of jobs that are sort of resistant to automation, they are caring jobs, communication jobs, community jobs, creative jobs, craft jobs, and construction jobs. And so in many ways, the new economy that we're going to be moving into is a high-tech, digitally enabled, pre-industrial economy. In other words, those 6 C's are the kinds of jobs that existed prior to the Industrial Revolution. So one way to think about the 21st century economy is we've come out the back end of that. We now let machines do what machines are good at. We do as humans what we are good at. And we depend on the digital infrastructure to get our daily needs met. And so this is the acceleration that we've seen into the future with this pandemic. And I actually think it's an opportunity for us to create a more sustainable, a more just, and a more equitable future for us all.
Thank you very much, Professor Fisher. Our next panelist is Dr. Penny Wheeler, CEO of Allina Health. Dr. Wheeler received her BA with honors from the University of Minnesota and her Doctor of Medicine from the University of Minnesota Medical School. She is a board-certified obstetrician and gynecologist. Prior to her appointment as CEO, she served as the Chief Clinical Officer of Allina Health, responsible for leading the organization's quality and value agenda through alignment of clinical and operational leadership to optimally benefit those served by Allina Health. Welcome, Dr. Wheeler.
Hi, it's great to be with you, all of you. I'm Penny Wheeler. I am fortunate to be the CEO of Allina Health, an organization that takes care of about 1 in 5 Minnesotans, has 28,000 wonderful human beings as part of the staff. And it's an organization I know well. I was even born here, at Eva Northwestern Hospital, which is part of Allina Health. So it's wonderful to be part of this organization. It's wonderful to be part of this dialogue. This has been no ordinary time, no question about it. And we, through this time of COVID, have taken care of about a third of the patients in our organization that are at need hospitalization for COVID, let alone taking care of people in our clinics who are afflicted by the virus as well. And of course, we're caring for others that don't have other health concerns that need to be cared for. Stroke, heart attacks, cancer diagnosis, you know all that, wonderful new births in the mother baby. I'm an obstetrician by trade, so I know that well. This is putting a tax on our whole community, no question. It's putting a tax on us personally, no question. And for us as a healthcare provider, a trusted asset upon which Minnesotans rely, it's been difficult. I will say that there's a heaviness to it. And I would say that there's also some silver linings. The heaviness to it, of course, is the disease burden that's in our community, the illness that has resulted, and now we're sitting at over 3,000 Minnesotans who have died of COVID. I'll say the heaviness also extends to our care team. So we have right now, we basically have almost nearly every bed filled we can. We're trying to increase the way that we can care for people. Not as hard to find protective equipment, or as hard to find ventilators, or as hard to find beds as it is to find highly trained individuals with compassion who are caring for their community. So what we're really challenged by now, as many of you know, is having the adequate staff to take care of the disease burden, both COVID and non-COVID in our community as it exists. They've been working hard. If you walked our floors, you would be so impressed with the expertise and compassion that our care team members are dealing with, be it a nurse or an environmental service worker or a respiratory therapist or a pharmacy member or a physician, and on it goes. It's hard not to just think of them with such gratitude every minute of every day for what they're doing for our community. Oftentimes not only just doing the caregiving, but because of the visitor restrictions, because of the virus, often trying to be a family member or link family members to those patients we serve as well. So first off, I'll say it's a heavy time. It's a heavy time for us personally, heavy time for our community. Certainly has been a heavy time for our caregivers as too. And so what's to become of it? Are there any good things to think about through this? I actually can think of a few. First of all, we're finding out that we can care for our patients by bringing our care closer to them when possible. So we have things like virtual care platforms where you can get in touch with a doctor or a nurse over online services. We have a home hospital program, so you can spend more nights in your own bed while having a care team care for you. And that's been really important during this COVID time. So we're actually extending ourselves to where the need is, making home a hub of care. That's been really important, for example, with the rising mental health issues too. We have now a telemental health and addiction program that's actually getting into and reaching into people's homes. So that's a real positive. Finding new ways to care where home becomes a hub of care. I'd say secondly, we're thinking about new ways to deliver healthcare and new ways to get rewarded for it. So we saw early in April when all of us had to decrease surgical things, how reliant our organizations are on the volume of services they do, number of things we do to the number of people. And that's how we get paid today. We'd much rather be paid for the health of the community. So when you see, if anything, COVID has amplified our desire and our moving forward to get actually paid for how well we do things and how affordably do we do them for our community. So we're looking at changing in relationship with our insurers in the market just what we're getting rewarded for, which is much better to get rewarded for health. I one time long ago, I heard one hospital president say, well, we didn't have a good month this month because we didn't have a good flu season. But they meant that not enough people were sick. That's not what we're about. We're about keeping people well. So I think movement towards getting rewards for value, which is what we all desire, is the another thing. Lastly, I'll say that I think we'll have moves toward greater equity, greater health equity. COVID has shined a bright light again on healthcare disparities and how certain racial and ethnic groups are disproportionately burdened by such diseases as COVID. And we can see that, when there are things like, difficulty being able to isolate yourself because you're in a more crowded living situation, or you have to be an essential worker, so you're out there on the front lines all the time and you don't have the wherewithal to work from home potentially, or you rely on public transportation. All of those things, born oftentimes of systemic racism, create disparities, and they've created it in this with a vast majority of overrepresentation by minority groups succumbing to COVID, dying of COVID, disproportionate numbers. So I think on those three scores, on making sure that we deliver healthcare closer to you in your home, making sure we're paid in the right way for how well do people do things and how affordable is the cost. And thirdly, making sure that we actually provide equitable care to all, and I mean all, of our citizens. So that's what I'll say, as a healthcare leader, proud to be one, proud to be a physician. And it's a heavy time. Sometimes the greatest light comes from the darkest times. I think if we really do our work well and don't get tired, it will come of this time too. So thank you very much for having me here as part of you today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wheeler. Our final panelist, Tom Hanson, needs no introduction for many in our audience. Tom is a very valued member of the Norway House community, and he has been a panelist on prior Minnesota Peace Initiative programs. Mr. Hanson holds a BA degree from the University of Minnesota and graduate degrees from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, the Institute of Advanced International Studies in Geneva, Switzerland, and the National School of Administration in Paris, France. Mr. Hanson is a former U.S. Foreign Service officer with the Department of State, whose diplomatic postings included East Germany, France, Norway, the Soviet Union, Sweden, and the former Soviet Republic of Georgia. Mr. Hanson currently serves as diplomat in residence at the Allworth Institute for International Affairs at the University of Minnesota, Duluth. Following Mr. Hanson's remarks, we will go immediately to the live portion of our webinar. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you very much, Janet, and thank you to the organizers of this event, Minnesota Peace Initiative, with assistance from Norway House. My task is to describe the international impact of the COVID crisis. And in a nutshell, COVID has been speeding up many trends that have existed already, trends toward a kind of a decoupling in the world economy, a deglobalization, and toward a regionalization, with regions emerging in a more multipolar world. So I will describe all of that very briefly here. First of all, if we look at COVID, I mean, it's been a terrible pandemic, but compared to past pandemics, as we can see here, it actually is a wake-up call that is a manageable one and should prepare us for any future pandemic of the kinds we've had in the past. I mean, take the 1918-1919 Spanish flu, which in the US, there were 500 million cases. That was 1/3 of our population at that time, which was 1.5 billion, with 50 million plus deaths. And of course, this has not been quite that extreme, and now we're getting a vaccine. But we could prepare for a worse pandemic, and this should spur us on to more cooperation also internationally against this kind of global threat. Now, the world obviously is about to start recovering from this. It's had a big economic impact, as we all know, unemployment around the world, economy shutting down. Many countries have gone into debt in order to handle this. And so the debt ratio to GNP today globally is 365%, which is a very heavy debt. And this will have to be unwound. There's talk about bringing supply chains home, import substitution in the developing world. So we'll be living with the economic impact for a long time. It's also impacted US-China relations. Our relations with China were marked by growing distrust even before the COVID crisis. In fact, if there'd been more trust when the crisis came out, we might have been able to cooperate better. But it's caused a further erosion of the relationship. In world opinion, both the US and China have taken a hit. China for the way it handled the beginning of the crisis, and the US for the way it's handled the epidemic overall. Worldwide, only 15% think we've done a good job in meeting the COVID epidemic. And trust in the US has come to a record low. You can see in a country like Germany, 26%. You can see this chart here. We are seen now as being unpredictable, so polarized that we go back and forth in an unpredictable fashion. It's not just one president or another, but it's a general sense of US unpredictability in light of our polarization. Surprisingly, the polling by Pew also shows that apart from countries in Asia, most of our allies in Europe especially see China already as the largest and most important economic power. This is not true. We're still ahead of China in traditional GDP terms, but the perception is important, I think. And China is getting some credit for the way they handled the pandemic. I would say that it's really not a question of autarky versus democracy in handling the pandemic. Countries with social capital and a level of trust did better, and that includes Germany, South Korea, Taiwan. So it's not just autocracies like China. Now, on leaving Secretary Pompeo has been pushing for an alliance of global democracies against specifically the Chinese Communist Party. It's almost a call to a new Cold War. It's got a heavy ideological input, go against the kind of autocracy we see in China. Now, President Biden also talks about renewing democracies and contact between democracies and renewing our alliances. He plans to join international institutions, be much more of a global player for the US. But he also has an eye on China, which he calls a competitor, even more on Russia, though, which he calls an opponent. So that's going to be a fraught relationship. But so both administrations are thinking of trying to marshal our allies globally, democracies, to more aggressively or less aggressively looking to China. But there's a trend out there that's being reinforced that I mentioned before, and that is a trend toward regionalization, toward greater regional role for countries as hegemons or cooperating together in their regions, which goes against this attempt to sort of reestablish US hegemony. A few quick examples. In Asia, China and the countries of Southeast Asia, there in the red, have just signed the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, a huge trade agreement which will have big impact for supply chains in Asia, 15 countries, including Japan and Korea. This is without the US, and this is going to tighten the region of Asia economically. It's a very important agreement. And of course, we pulled out of the TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership. So this is important. Africa is starting to see itself as a region. Just late last year, 54 out of 55 countries in Africa signed a free trade agreement. The only one that didn't was Morocco. Africa is very important for the future, demographically and economically, and so this is a regional trend that's happening. And then, perhaps most important, what China's doing in Eurasia is a regional policy, the Belt and Road Initiative, the One Belt, One Road. Russia is very much involved with its 11 time zones across Eurasia, and increasingly Iran, which is along with Afghanistan and Pakistan, is kind of a linchpin of the Belt and Road. So this is leading to regional alignments. Russia, China, and Iran are at the early stages of coming together more. The three leaders are cooperating. They had their first military exercise. There's a big partnership agreement about to be signed between China and Iran. So another example, once again, of regional dynamics that are happening outside of the US as we're so distracted by our domestic politics and COVID. The world is getting on and very much in a regionalizing direction. Last point I want to make is that, as you've heard from other speakers, the COVID crisis is speeding up the move toward the Internet of Things, toward the IoT, toward online, digital. Our big tech companies are getting stronger. This is very important. It'll be a big part of the future, but we have to be careful of the implications. Now, we all know that China is using the new technologies to develop a kind of governance, which they call the social credit system, which tracks everyone through facial recognition. People are monitored through tech and receive rewards and punishments. This is something that Mike Pompeo, for example, sees as a reason for the world to galvanize against the Communist Party of China. But we should not be asleep at the switch of what's happening here domestically. A very important book came out last year by Shoshana Zuboff of Harvard, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. The surveillance is happening here. The difference is it's being done by large companies like Clearview AI, which use web scraping technology to get billions of images off the internet, other information which they then buy and sell to other corporations and also to the US government, to ICE, to police forces. It's a two-step process of a kind of a surveillance that we really have to be careful about and monitor in the aftermath of COVID. So to conclude, as I said earlier, this should be a wake-up call for greater international cooperation. The global threats that face us in many ways are more dire than the geopolitical threats. We have to keep our priorities in mind, and we need to restore trust, both domestically here and internationally. This is going to require diplomacy. It's going to require confidence building. If we draw these lessons from COVID, I think we'll be a step ahead as a result of this crisis. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions during the discussion.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists for those very impressive opening remarks. I'm now going to ask our panelists a few questions, and as you send in your questions, we will incorporate your questions as well. I'm going to start with you, Professor Fisher. In your opening remarks, you gave us some very fascinating look back at both the cholera epidemic and the flu pandemic from 1918 and what dramatic changes it made in how we live our lives. If you and I could get in a time machine and go ahead 100 years, so if we were at 2120 looking back, what do you think would be the major or the big takeaways that we would at that point study and say, this is what came out of that big pandemic?
Thank you, Janet, for that question. I think, as we just heard Penny talk about, I think we're going to see a renewed interest in public health, which tends to follow every pandemic. And as Tom just talked about, I think we're also going to see global regionalization of powers. So I think that all three of us are looking ahead at what the new normal will be like. I tend to focus a little bit more internally in terms of our daily lives. I definitely think that we will see a rebalancing of the relationship of what we do physically and digitally. I think that we will, as we have already discovered, that we can do a lot of things remotely. And so I think we are going to see a lot of functional activities happening digitally. We will increasingly, instead of flying around the world and exposing ourselves to potential zoonotic disease and future epidemics, that we will increasingly be doing conferences remotely, communicating remotely. So we, at one hand, we will be more globally connected digitally and more locally based physically. I think we will be increasingly moving bits around the world rather than bodies and belongings. And so I think that that will be a profound shift in how we live our daily lives. I think that will have environmental implications that we already have seen. I mean, air pollution in many cities has gotten much better. 20 times more lives have been saved in China from reduced air pollution than the number of people who have been killed by COVID-19. And so I think we have to sort of recognize that COVID, while a huge crisis, is also an opportunity for us to sort of ask the more fundamental question that Penny was asking: how do we achieve community health, and what does that mean? I think we're also going to see the opportunity for people to, in some ways, live and work anywhere. And so people will increasingly move where there's high quality of life, where there are, I think, thematized kinds of places to live. I've been active down in Rochester with the Destination Medical Center, and the idea that if you can live and work anywhere, why not live next to the world's best hospital? And so I think we will start to see cities and regions starting to compete for talent globally because people can literally live and work anywhere. And so I think it will force regions to think about what is their value proposition and why would people want to live there. And then finally, as I said in my remarks, I think we are at the tail end of a wave of automation. In many ways, we have recognized that there are many things that machines do better than what we can do. And we are moving into, I think, a high-tech version of a pre-industrial economy where automation, software, robotics will do a lot of the things that are predictable, repetitive, or dangerous for people to do. And that we will be back doing what humans are actually better at doing, which is human interaction, caring, communicating, building community, creative work, craft work. And so I think that we need to rethink our educational system, move out of a 20th century or kind of industrial model of education and move to a 21st century educational system that encourages people to do the things that people are particularly well suited to do.
Thank you. Dr. Wheeler, you did a superb job of conveying to all of us, I think, the heaviness of this pandemic for patients and for your staff. And I know I speak for everybody when I hope you will send our appreciation to your staff, your whole organization for all you're doing. You look for silver linings. I guess I think a number one question that most people have is, have we learned anything so we can be better prepared for a future one? It may not be another 100 years before we have one. We keep hearing about we could have another virus or even this virus could mutate. So what do you think the medical community is starting to recognize they could do, or even as a country? What can we do to be better prepared next time?
Yeah, well, thanks, Janet. I just really appreciate being here. I get so fascinated by Professor Fisher and Hanson that I have to think about my own things because I'm loving learning from them and listening to them. So thank you for being here. You know, boy, I hope a lot. It's interesting to hear Professor Fisher talk about how the investments go up in public health. I mean, we in this country, maybe even more particular than others, have really have very little invested in public health. And we did not connect public health resources to clinical care very well. So they sat in different worlds and different spheres. I'm on now, as are the leaders of the major health organizations in this state, on a call at least weekly with the Department of Health and thinking about public health and working together. So I would say it's formed a different, I thought about how when you were looking at those regional collaborations globally, we're now forming them from a healthcare perspective. We're all not-for-profit healthcare. Our job is to serve the community. We meet at least several times a week, and how can we serve people better collectively? We've already, through this pandemic, for example, have put together a critical care coordination center. So we've already transferred nearly 300 people who needed critical care beds but couldn't get it in the community in which they live. So we're working between places. So I hope that collaboration continues and that will advance healthcare. And I hope the intersection with public health won't be so siloized, in the future as well. In addition, I hope we have learned that a patchwork approach to things does not really help. Things. So I will say that the politicalization of this has just been really harmful. It's we've lost lives because of it. And so to approach a pandemic of this sort as a nation and a people collectively to protect the health of others, I hope that's a lesson that's been learned by each and every one of us as well.
We all do. Tom, you certainly made it very clear that you see us moving much more towards regionalism. But just from a kind of our national standpoint, what do you think that's going to mean for us? I mean, you've already showed that we're declining in how the rest of the world sees us as a power. What will that regionalization mean for us, for our economy, for our national security? I'll say for my own parochial question, for all those of us that love global travel and have traveled freely for 25 years, what's all that going to happen? How's all that going to change or stay the same in the future?
Well, thanks, Janet, for that question. And first of all, thank you very much to Penny and Tom for your remarks. I think we agree on the question you just posed, that there's a lot of trend out there toward regionalization. So how is this going to affect us? Well, I mean, the perception is that we are receding to some extent. Now, whether it's because of our polarization and a certain degree of dysfunction that's become quite clear, isn't that something that we can get beyond? Is this sort of receding of America more in relative terms? Because when you look at the world, how could it be otherwise? I mean, our role in the global economy since 1945 has been an aberration. And as a result of the destruction of World War II in other countries. And a country like China now is coming up close to our GDP. I mean, if you look at demographics, the UN projects that Africa will account for 39% or so of the global population in 2100. Asia, 44%. The US, 4%. I mean, the West, what we call the West, will be 10% or less of the human population. So how can it be otherwise? So I think one of the key aspects is as the world is going back to a normal state of affairs, which we might call regionalization, we need to adapt to this and play it to our advantage. And it's up to us to do that. And in my view, it means getting involved with other countries multilaterally, not trying to put our finger in the dike and hold off trends that, quite frankly, are ineluctable. So these trends existed before the pandemic. I agree with Tom and Penny that this is speeding up a lot of these trends. Supply chains are being relocated. I mean, and the Chinese are welcoming this now. They're allowing Tesla to actually have 100% control of their company in China. They don't have to do what Apple did and rely on supply chains. And I mentioned before that we're in trying to kind of react against China, we're trying to set up alliance systems. I think we're going to need cooperation rather than blocks. I think if we move back toward a block mentality as in the Cold War, it's going to hurt our own interests. I mean, Henry Kissinger once said that if we try to stop China's growth because we feel threatened by their success, we'll end up isolated in the world, and that may happen. On travel, Airbnb just released statistics. 80% of their business now takes place within the country where people live. The typical Airbnb traveler now is going maybe 120 miles at most from their home. Now, is this a shift that will continue? We'll see. But it's a market change. People do not want to go to the big magnet cities so much anymore. They don't want to go to Paris. They want to go out into the Dordogne or somewhere out where it's rural. So we'll see whether these trends continue. But I agree with our other speakers that there'll be some permanent changes here, maybe a little more localization, and in the U.S., sort of a premier inter pares state. We've got to change our self-image at a certain point more realistically.
Tom, I just want to follow up on the global travel because we got a question from the audience on it. And I think the specific question is, are we going to be unwelcome? Will these regions or these political stresses make it more difficult? Will we find it more difficult to travel as freely as we have?
Well, that'll kind of depend on us, I guess. Right now, we, because of our very high COVID statistics, we really can't travel to most countries. We aren't in anybody's bubble that I'm aware of for travel. So that's one thing. Beyond that, though, I don't see any reason why we wouldn't be, once the pandemic is over, as able to travel. I mean, you've always had the idea of the ugly American traveling, and nobody closed their borders to us during that period. So, I don't worry so much about that, but I do worry about reestablishing confidence among other countries in our governance and on our ability to meet the challenges, not just of a rising China, but of climate change, of future pandemics, of our own inequalities that have been stressed here today. I mean, it's really up to us ultimately.
Okay, thank you. Professor Fisher, we have an audience question, which is, if people do live in urban areas, what is life in urban areas going to be like? What do you predict in terms of living in dense urban populations in the future?
Well, there's been a lot of conversation about whether this pandemic will lead people to flee cities. I think that we will see a balancing of where people will decide to live in a curious way. I think that the ability to work anywhere, if you have a good internet connection, will enable us to sort of revive smaller towns. But that doesn't mean that I think cities are going to disappear or dramatically change, because a huge percentage of our GDP, our economy, comes out of cities, and cities are sort of places where there's a lot of interaction of creativity and a lot of innovation. And so I don't see cities changing in terms of the central role that they play in our economy. However, I do think that we will see small scale changes that are probably, as it happened in the wake of previous pandemics, more oriented toward public health and safety. So, for example, John Snow's original work on moving from the miasma to the germ theory of disease with the Broad Street well in London. I mean, recognizing that cities are both the places where pandemics sometimes occur, but also some of the first places that react, and putting in sanitary sewers and indoor plumbing and all the other things that we now take for granted. And I think we will see the same. I think we will see, for example, much more contactless operation of things, so that we now have the ability to walk through doors without having to touch handles. They operate without our having to touch them. We can voice activate elevators. So there will be more just voice activation, so we won't have to touch surfaces as much. I think we will see the rise of this kind of use of UV to blast spaces to eliminate germs and viruses between occupation of rooms, for example. So we're going to see a lot of that kind of technology coming into our cities that will enable us to still interact, but create safer environments for people.
I just have a quick follow-up that came in also. Public transportation is a very important part of living in cities. So now some of these remedies that you just suggested would also work for public transportation, but that seems to be a big question. Is what do you think of the future of public transportation to support urban populations?
Well, again, it's a great question. I don't know, but I do think, for example, that there's research showing that there's a great wariness of people getting into buses and trains, at least in the short term. That may change. Again, I think we're going to see new kinds of sanitation practices, new ways to clean shared spaces like buses and light rail cars. But I also think we're going to see the rise of autonomous vehicles and mobility services that will enable us to take lots of small sort of public transportation vehicles that may be personal vehicles. There's the emergence of one-person vehicles that's coming. And so I think we will see a much wider range of transportation options for people based on what you're comfortable with, what you're willing to pay for. That will be a mobility services provided by what are now car companies, will be mobility service companies. And again, this idea of, for example, using UV to clean interior spaces between occupation, I think we'll see in transportation as well.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Wheeler, you cannot go very far into any discussion of healthcare without really getting into the big healthcare issues. We've got a number of questions around what would it take, or realistically, do you think we will change the way you get rewarded? And will we change enough to provide the level of healthcare people need? We've got a question. What do you think of a single payer system? I know that any discussion of healthcare can go all night, but we do have real interest in your suggestion about we might actually see some changes in the way healthcare is delivered and paid for. And then if you would comment on single payer, since we clearly had a question on that from our audience.
Yeah. Yeah, I do think, first of all, we were going there anyway, and we need to, because it's the way that it aligns with, I was taught as a leader, never forget who you're serving and why. I mean, we want the best health outcomes for the people we serve, and we want to do it at affordable rates. And that's what we want. That's what the payers of healthcare want. That's what providers of healthcare want, and that's certainly what the people we serve want. So that's where we need to go anywhere. And there was actually pretty good agreement, on the policy side of things, at least, that we should move towards more, getting paid more for the best outcomes per dollar spent. So we did have agreement even across the sides of the aisle that that should be the case. And so they moved towards things like Medicare Advantage, which rewards us for how well we do things for the people we serve and how well we support them to stay well, as opposed to just responding when they're ill. That has, bipartisan support, that model. And a lot of the models coming out of the Center for Medicaid and Medicaid Services, and where they go, oftentimes follow. So there was movement there anyway. It was slower than anybody anticipated. That said, we said even before COVID, we as an organization signed our biggest private insurer that pays us, for about a quarter of our revenue. We signed a deal with to pay us for outcomes per dollar rather than fee for service. How many things we do to how many people. So we were moving there as an organization. I would say that COVID amplified the need to move there. COVID has amplified a lot of industries that are ripe for disruption, and ours is one of them, right? Education, to Professor Fisher's statements, is likely another. But yes, I do think there is movement there. I'm not wedded to exactly, I'm wedded to the getting rewards for outcomes per dollar spent. I'm not necessarily wedded to saying whether that's a single payer, model and or not. I just want to make sure that that's what the reward system relies on, because that's what the people we serve certainly deserve. And then we have to make sure that that's not only for some, but it's for all. So the equity part of healthcare is also something that I actually I think so many are committed to changing for the future, because the healthcare disparities, as they exist too in education, are something we have to overcome. And I think that will be the case as well. And when you pay for things that reward outcomes, then you can better deal with issues of equity as well, like care support services. The things that matter most to the people now, like cancer care coordination or things like that, are things we get paid for. When you start to pay for things that really matter most to people, then you can provide, more care, more home care, more equitable care for the future.
Okay. Tom, we have certainly seen the rise of a few strong men around the country. Turkey, Brazil, the USSR. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm really dating myself. Russia. And we've certainly seen, at least in the last few weeks here, a strain on our own democratic electoral system. So what do you see as the future of democracy? Not just ours, but democracy around the world. Is it on the decline? Is it going to survive? Is it going to thrive? What do you see?
Well, in a nutshell, it's a big question. Once again, this is a case where existing trends are being sped up potentially. So, we were already in what they call a democratic recession globally. Most of the organizations that monitor this, Freedom House and others, basically say that really since the end of the 1990s, the trend has been going in the wrong direction globally. We've seen the rise of populism, obviously. Also, in many cases around the world, leaders elected democratically and then undermining the institutions of democracy from within on the basis of a democratic election and then getting reelected. So it's a troubling phenomenon. And of course, China's performance in the pandemic has also created, in some minds, a model of other ways of doing things. It's The Economist magazine now estimates that by the end of 2021, China will be back to exactly what their growth had been predicted to be before the pandemic. In other words, as if the pandemic had never happened. They're recovering much, much faster. They're using tech to do this. I mentioned earlier that this does not mean that necessarily that authoritarian states are better. It's a matter of trust and social capital too. But and it is true that the groups that probably have performed least well are the populist leaders around the world. I hate to include our own country in that, but I will. Bolsonaro in Brazil, Modi in India. I think you could add Boris Johnson in the UK. Populist leadership has not done well in this pandemic. So, to get democracy going, we have to get at the trust issue, and we have to get at the inequality issue. Among my students and also previous generation of students, I see how the attitudes toward democracy are changing, even among our own population. The people who went through the 2008 crisis, just as they were emerging into the job market, or the ones now trying to emerge from the university or into a job of any kind in the COVID crisis, have a very different experience from what the boomer generation had. And it's leading to a lesser adherence to democracy. There are huge generational differences. When asked whether democracy is a key factor, sort of ranking the most important things in life, the boomers, it's up over 70%. For people in more recent generations, it's down as low as 30%, and it's even worse in Europe. So once again, this is happening all through the West. Yes, there's a huge challenge to democracy, and I hope that we learn from this pandemic that we've got to work together. We have to have not just alliances with other countries, but alliances inside of our borders. We need trust. We need a much more public-private cooperation, sort of national policies that get some of these issues realigned, because otherwise I think our democracy could be under greater strain.
Do you think that some of that lack of, the decline in the appreciation of democracies in age groups as they get younger, do you think some of that is we've stopped teaching civics, we've stopped teaching sort of the history and the governance of our country? And I don't know if that's true of European countries, but do you think that that's part of it, that people just don't understand the mechanism of the various ways of governance and why we have the one we have and what makes it important to us?
I think that could be part of the mosaic. I mean, it is true that teaching things like civics is less common nowadays. I think just the way the media functions in general is part of it. It's such a fragmented series of echo chambers, and these new generations have been fully subjected to it as they've grown up. They don't really have any other benchmarks. So I sometimes worry that getting information based on imagery as opposed to the written word, that's going to sound very, very old-fashioned, but people are more easily manipulated in a kind of an image-based environment because it's reactive. So I think there are many, many things that are contributing to this. One aspect of the inequality, I mean, one of the best books out this year about our economy is called Deaths of Despair, where it's looking at the effect on the middle and lower middle class of what's been happening in the last decades. I think that probably our family structures in those groups especially are not particularly strong, and that's where values are imparted. That's where the kind of things we're talking about are enracinated. So a lot of things going on, but I think that we can, if we're aware of the problem, we can work towards solving it.
Good. Professor Fisher, we have from the audience 2 or 3 different questions about climate change and what the future holds. What are the patterns that you're seeing emerge now, perhaps expedited by the pandemic? What are they? How do you see them either reducing the challenge of, or the projection of climate change destruction we were on? We have a question about if we become a delivery economy, what that does, either more vehicles, less vehicles, how that's going to impact it. What can you kind of tell our audience about how you and your colleagues are starting to think about climate change and what the changes that came about from COVID might mean for it?
Well, yeah, great question, complicated question. I mean, it's going to lead to a lot of global tensions of the sort that Tom's been talking about as we see large numbers of environmental refugees, which I think will continue to be a stressor globally. But in terms of more sort of local conditions,
8 o'clock.
we're definitely seeing a shift away from commuting 9 to 5. I think we're starting to see less air travel, which I actually think is going to be a long-term trend. I really think that we're going to start to see people questioning whether you have to hop in a plane to fly across the country to have an hour meeting and then fly home. I think that some of these were old habits that are simply don't make any sense anymore. And so we're going to start to see a changing travel behavior, which is going to have an effect on air pollution, for example. I think that we will, for example, this is an issue in our region. I think we're going to start to see environmental refugees moving internally in this country, and we're going to be a destination region. So that we may see over this century, millions of people starting to come here. I mean, we've already read articles in the New York Times about how places like the Twin Cities and particularly Duluth is a destination. And so I think we have to be realistic about that, you know, we need to get ready for what are we going to do with a diaspora of people coming here and not have the kind of reactions that we've seen in Europe against refugees, but to recognize that this is a talent pool. We have to figure out how to employ people and utilize all of this talent. But so I do think we're going to see, you know, certain parts of North America, certain cities globally that are on very close to sea level, increasingly abandoned, people moving inland. We're going to see droughts. We're going to see food scarcities. We're going to see a number of longer term trends that are going to have to simply be addressed. And I think that this gets to maybe a theme of all three of our remarks, which is we need an era of greater cooperation, that we have to recognize that we can't be so tribal, so siloed, so fearful of others. And in fact, recognize that these trends, be they health trends, be they environmental trends, are opportunities for us to cooperate in new ways and accommodate movements of people. We are going to see a century of a lot of movement of the population globally.
A couple days after the article, the New York Times came out, which said, as you said, Duluth, Minnesota is the most perfect and livable place post as we endure the changes coming with global warming. I talked to a friend in Duluth and I said, "Oh, did you happen to see it?" And she said, "Happened to see it. It's been photocopied and taped inside the door of every business in Duluth." So I think they're waiting. So they're looking forward to it. Dr. Wheeler, I have a question for you about vaccines, but we have several questions from the audience about vaccines. So I'm going to try to kind of weave them together. I have a particular interest in, has the speed of warp speed vaccine development, does it give you confidence that we're going to be much better at coming up with vaccines for a lot of diseases, coming up with them much faster and, you know, really cutting the time it takes to develop something? Even for things like cancer or other things, will we just get much better at understanding the genetics of other diseases and how to deal with them? That's my question, but we have several questions from the audience around this vaccine. What do you think the medical organization and the government can do to get more people to accept and take the vaccine? What do you think the willingness of the public will be to take the vaccine? So there's a lot of questions around how well we're going to distribute and benefit from the vaccines that are coming.
Yeah, well, a few comments. Thank you for the question, and it's on everybody's mind, and it's a ray of light, I think, in a dark time. So I do think that the production of this vaccine will, and the way it's been produced, using a technology with messenger RNA, it's called, that's been, you know, around for about 20 years, but actually now is looking to be very prominent in the effectiveness of these vaccines, will allow us to It's remarkable. This vaccine, Professor Fisher can tell us sooner, but the speed of this vaccine relative to what they faced in 1918, the Spanish flu is just light years away. And the effectiveness thus far, in the trials looks good too. I will say too that, well, people say, we do worry about the trust factor and the misinformation, the anti-vax movement and what that will do. And people saying, oh, it's so new. It's so new, but there's been manufacturers that have been rushing into these spaces. So they've now, well over, 100,000 people have had this vaccine. So it's been, yes, new, but the scale of it and the number of people who have already been in these trials has been pretty remarkable. So, and it does look like it's going to tick all the boxes of a very thorough FDA process, in getting there. So that's positive. We have challenges with the vaccine. The one that came out first and most effective has to be stored at a temperature that's like Antarctica. And all the current vaccines that have been shown to be effective are 2-dose vaccines. And we have to look at the storage. And of course, it won't be a light switch. It will be, we're still running a marathon here, even if everybody agreed to be vaccinated. We won't have widespread vaccination available probably until, the weather gets pretty warm here. So we need bigger quantities. So I want to make sure that, there's hope there. I don't want people to think it's going to be overnight, that we will have the volumes. And then to the acceptance. Boy, that's a really interesting question. Earlier on, this was before we had as much data about the effectiveness and the number of people who had been immunized. Actually, we learned much about it, sadly, because we had so many people infected with the virus that we actually could learn about the effectiveness sooner because of the rampant virus in the community. But even then, early on, 40% of nurses in a study said that they wouldn't take that they might take the vaccine. 60% of doctors, that's not going to do it. I mean, these are people based on science. So we have a lot to do, I think, to be able to, look at and actually recruit people to do this, for the health of themselves and actually those around us. So I think there's work there to do, and getting out the right information will appeal to some. Other messages will appeal to others in terms of the rationale for getting a vaccination going forward. But we do worry about, what will the acceptance rate be of the vaccination? And I'm hoping it's quite high because the data looks very strong. And now we're seeing longer term effects of COVID, even for those who have had asymptomatic infections. So the risk reward here doesn't look too hard to do, but we do worry about the number of people who will accept it. So
I'm going to follow up with a question that someone from the audience. I'm going to put a little different twist on it, though. Do we have some past experience? And I'm going to point out polio. And we got a question about polio and what did we remember? What did we learn from that? But do we know from other sort of big major rollouts of vaccine, even if you have early on kind of I'm not sure I'll take it. Do we have experience that says once it gets started, people start to say, I'll buy in and plus, knowing that I won't have the lingering impacts of COVID, the long-termers, I think they call them, people who have long-term impacts from COVID. So it's not just dying, it's also long-term. So do we have any experience that says, yeah, every time we have one of these, we get a lot of people saying, I'm not so sure I'll take it. But then once we get going, we do get a real buy-in. And so we should be optimistic that we'll get a majority of people, coming around.
Yeah. We do have, some of that. When it becomes a norm, then obviously it accelerates. That said, I do worry that we have different channels now that we didn't have in the polio environment. We have a more diverse, nation and world, and we have to the point made out by others these imagery and the social media that can amplify misinformation in a harmful way. So I do worry about some of those counter forces, and doing everything we can to make this be the norm with trusted elders in the community, or those respected community leaders, citizens, healthcare professionals. I think that anything we can do it's not a matter of educating, it's more a matter of recruiting, I think, so that people, this becomes a norm. It's going to be critical for us to get on the other side of this, and has, huge health implications, huge economic implications, huge life implications.
Tom, as I said, we've gotten quite a few questions on climate. So several of them have to do with your area, which is the global impact. And questions around, has the way we responded to COVID, does that tell us anything about how we might respond to climate refugees? For instance, would we close borders? Would everybody take their own approach to how they're going to deal with it? Would we have more cooperation or less cooperation among nations than we might have had pre-COVID? So just what do you think, you and others who look at kind of world policy, what are we taking away from the way we're handling the COVID pandemic that might tell us something about how we're going to handle the coming climate change issues?
Well, Janet, I think there are two schools on this right now. Some people see the climate, or rather the COVID crisis, as the sort of shared global threat that's at a planetary level, which absolutely requires cooperation, both internationally and domestically amongst ourselves. And therefore, the COVID crisis should be a wake-up call for other crises of this kind, including climate change, and that therefore, if people think clearly about this, and it ought to be a positive factor. The other school would say, well, no, wait a minute. We already have vaccination nationalism going on. Early in the pandemic, our own country, did things that were sort of making sure everything was for us, and that therefore it kind of a so everyone trying to save themselves mentality could also result from something like this. So I'm optimistic that it's going to be a wake-up call to greater cooperation. We have the COP26 follow-up to the Paris Climate Agreement, which got postponed. It's now going to be in Glasgow, November 1st to the 12th. It looks like we are going to come back on board. China has announced that it wants to be carbon neutral by 2060. There are very positive signs on the climate front. More and more corporations are signing on, at least in theory, to this. So, I think that the COVID experience, if it does reinforce this idea of needing to cooperate more, it could have a carryover effect. I think there are many signs now that the whole CO2 issue is being attacked from various sides. Coal is emerging as the big problem. In a lot of countries who are very idealistic about CO2 emissions are doubling down on coal, to include Germany and others. So it's a very mixed result right now on climate. But anyway, I'm very much hoping that the first school of thought, that COVID will actually give an impetus to climate cooperation, that's what's going to prevail.
We hope so. Professor Fisher, we got a very interesting question from the audience, and I think it fits in your area. And the question basically is, we've really moved towards our questioner says, extreme individualism. And we're losing our sense of social collectivism, of doing things together and being in the same boat together. I'm kind of putting words in the questioner's mouth. But what do you see? Do you see these patterns increasing? As you say, we're going to live and work more in our individual homes. Do you see individualism becoming even on steroids after this? Or do you think we're starting to see that we need each other, at least to solve problems? can you kind of address it? Because his final question was, what can we do to move more towards social collectivism to help each other, or should we? So why don't you try and take a crack at that?
Sure. Another great question. I mean, I think that there's sort of two camps to sort of follow what Tom was saying on this. I mean, the digital environment, as we've discovered, has created a level of tribalism where everybody is listening to their own news, sort of in echo chambers, and sort of feeling like the other is the enemy. And that is, I think, a tremendously dangerous effect of the digital environment. A lot of misinformation. In fact, it's the place where cyber war is going to be fought in the future. I mean, so there's a lot of that potential out there, which is to isolate people, to tribalize people. And on the other hand, and I think we're seeing this in our own neighborhoods as people are increasingly working at home, living at home, you're getting to know your neighbors, people are spending more time in their neighborhoods. We do a lot of work with people experiencing homelessness, and we find that we're working with the faith community, and we've been finding churches who are very conservative and very liberal, they all agree on helping the homeless. And so they've built these kind of networks of people working together to solve problems that isn't at all about tribalism. And so I think the other side to that is, how can we reconnect to communities, to our neighborhoods, and to work on common projects, common problems, that isn't sort of framed in ideological ways, but it's framed in more practical ways. And I'm hoping that we move in the latter direction, because I think the tribalism that we are getting now is really destructive politically, socially, and in almost every other way. And so, but I'm hopeful that we reconnect to people in face-to-face kinds of activities as a result of our being able to live and work almost anywhere. We want to be in places that we care about.
Dr. Wheeler, we have an interesting question from the audience, and I guess I'm going to link it to COVID, although the audience member did not, and that is, we've been reading these stories about healthcare systems being hacked into and ransom being offered. And again, that's not really linked to COVID, except, is there some reason, do you think, why this is happening now? And as Dr. Fisher said, one of the things these pandemics do is open up our weaknesses, show us our weaknesses. Do you think that, is it just coincidental, or is there something about the COVID situation that hackers think you're more vulnerable, or anyway, but do you think this is going to also cause you and other healthcare executives to really rethink your cybersecurity and do a lot more about your cybersecurity?
Yeah, well, thank you. I think, and maybe to Professor Fisher's, maybe the results of tribalism is some of these nefarious forces that come into play and try to actually penetrate organizations and industries when they're at their very most vulnerable. And that's what's happening now in healthcare. We, of course, are scrambling to try to take care of the communities in the best possible way. And we have seen increased attempts at trying to penetrate some of our security systems, as well. We have millions of attempts a day, millions. And, anybody who's in any industry facing cybersecurity threats will tell you it's not a matter of if it will happen, but when it will happen, despite your best chances. And sadly, we've seen even in our community, knock on something, but not yet for our organization, but these ransomware attacks. So cybersecurity, we hold patients' information as sacrosanct. And so that people would try to get at that most sacred information and try to do harm at a time when we are so focused on the care needed for the community is really disappointing. But the cybersecurity threats are very real, and they're heightened, and they have been heightened to the tune of about 3 times the number of penetration hits you're getting right now.
Okay. Good luck.
Thank you.
It's a big challenge. So, Tom, I'm going to give you the last question of the evening. So I'm going to make it one that I think we're all interested in, and I also got a couple of questions from the audience on. And that is, what do you see as the future for organizations we've held sacred for 60 years? The UN, NATO, some of our other regional alliances, are they a thing of the past? Are they just taking a pause and they're going to be strengthened and more vital in the future? What do you think lies ahead for some of these institutions that we've relied on?
Well, I mean, to the extent that we get clear-minded about what the threats really are, as I said before, we're facing shared global threats more and more. I mean, we just have to keep reinforcing that realization. To the extent we realize that, then these institutions are more important than ever. I mean, something like the UN, especially, you know, the whole COVAX initiative now of trying to get access to vaccines for the entire world. 180 countries have signed up. It's the World Health Organization and other organizations coming together. China just joined. I think the Biden administration has said it is going to join this. I mean, so these are the kind of things where, yes, the UN has very much a role to play. Similarly on arms control, you know, there's an arms race getting underway that is totally underreported. I'm just struck by, you know, during the Cold War, our mainstream media would cover this almost, you know, weekly. I mean, what's the state of the arms race? Well, it's not covered at all. And in fact, it's exploding with new technologies, hypersonic weapons, small dialyl nuclear weapons, space-based weapons. All these things are coming on, and it's going to require international cooperation and coordination. It's going to require new institutions internationally to handle this. Probably for future pandemics, there should be new institutions. So I think, once again, to the extent we understand to the extent we have situational awareness, it should become an era of strengthening all these institutions. You know, the alternative is that they do begin to fall apart. I mean, NATO has been looking for a role, and it's been weakened in the last few years. You know, both China and Russia and even the US now are approaching the Europeans bilaterally, which is weakening their attempt to have a larger grouping of nations. So there are countervailing trends too. But once again, I'm optimistic that of the two scenarios we're talking about, it seems that the first one will prevail, and we'll have a strengthening of some of these institutions.
Good. We hope so. Well, thank you all for joining us this evening. If there's one thing we try to do on our programs, whether it's in person or on a webinar, is to respect your time and to close promptly on time. So in closing, I'd like to thank those who have helped to make this evening a success. First of all, I'd like to thank our panelists. And unfortunately, in a webinar, we don't give you the big round of applause that we would if we were at the McNamara. But I think if we listen hard, we can hear the audience and all of us giving you a big thank you for a very, very interesting evening. As a token of appreciation, we have a special gift for you. And in recognition of the peacemaking role that Norway plays in the world, and in recognition of Minnesota's Native American heritage that we value, we have for you a Native American sacred pipe, which is made from Minnesota native pipestone. And it looks like this.
Okay.
For those of you who are on the screen.
Ah,
We will deliver
beautiful.
it to you, yes.
Wow.
And we hope you will cherish it as a memento of tonight's program. I also want to thank the board of the Norway House. I want to thank the executive team of the Norway House, which includes Christina Carlton, Robin Cole, and Drew Howe. They did just a fabulous job of supporting this webinar, and we all really appreciate it. Larry Bakken is the chair of the Minnesota Peace Initiative, so we want to thank him for his leadership. Thank you to all of the committee members for their work and their support of the program. We have a really great committee, and I will say we have a lot of fun. We really enjoy it. And so any of you who enjoy these programs and want to be part of them, we would love to have you join our committee and help design and plan the programs for the future. I want to encourage you to visit the Norway House website. This webinar will be available on that website with the slides. And you can also learn a lot more about the Norway House, its mission, and upcoming events like the Gingerbread House exhibit, which is on right now. And it is a very popular event. And I encourage any of you who are interested to check on the website. I also urge you to contribute to the capital campaign to build a Norway House. We have been raising money for some time now and will be breaking ground in spring of 2021. And we have raised approximately 16.5 million of the 18 million goal. So all you have to do is contribute just a little bit and you can help us go over our goal. And finally, we want to thank you, all of you who have joined us this evening. We also appreciate very much your patience with us and our webinar format. We really appreciate it. We hope to be back together for live programs soon. Our next program is the spring, next spring, and we will see as Petty and all her colleagues roll out that vaccine. We'll see where we are next spring. We may have to do one more webinar and then look to the fall for our first in-person webinar or program in some time. In closing, we, all of us from the Minnesota Peace Initiative, all of us from the Norway House, and I think I speak for our panelists, and I hope I know I speak for everyone who's tuned in to our webinar tonight. We all want to extend our sincere condolences to all the families who have lost someone in this COVID pandemic. We want to extend our best wishes for full recovery for anyone who gets the virus. And finally, we want all of you to stay as healthy as you can as we all wait for those life-saving vaccines that are coming very soon. So thank you very much. Take care. And as I said earlier, to leave the program, just hit leave the program, which is up on the top of your screen. And we will see you at our next program, either in person or on a webinar. Take care. Thank you.